Okay, folks, welcome to another video of me recapping the lesson for today. So today is March 12th, Monday, and we worked on gross domestic product. So we talked about how is it calculated and why do we use it. It's a really important economic indicator, probably the most important and the most widely used. So in class, I had you walk around and see if you could find other people who might have known the definitions. And you did a really good job at that because they are hard economic terms. Now, I wouldn't give you vocabulary or definitions to write down if I didn't think they were important. And all of these are important for calculating GDP. So we'll go over a few of them. So GDP, obviously pretty important for understanding what it is. It's the value of all goods and services within a country. So it sounds simple, but there's a lot that goes into this. Pretty much all economic activity within a country's borders is counted in GDP. So per capita GDP, let me get rid of that, sorry. This is annoying. Okay. Per capita GDP is just GDP divided by the amount of people who live in a country. So you take the number, the GDP, and you divide it by the amount of people who live there. You can have a per capita GDP of a country, of a state, of a county, of a city. Any unit of government can have a GDP. Anytime you see something referred to as standard of living, they're talking about GDP per capita. So per capita GDP, standard of living, same thing. It's one of those economics terms that really doesn't need to be named twice, but we do anyway. Consumption, that's the amount of money that people spend on goods and services. So if I were to go out and buy a coffee from Starbucks and put gasoline in my car on the way to get there, and while I'm on my way, buy a sandwich from Jersey Mike's and then go to Ross and buy new shoes, all of that would be counted in GDP. That's all consumption. That's stuff I'm purchasing and using the goods and services. Investment, it's just money used to gain a profitable return. You can understand why that's counted in GDP. It's money spent by individuals in order to make more money. So we count that. Government spending. So that's, I feel like, the most straightforward of all these definitions. It's how much money does the government spend on goods and services? If you can think of any examples of things the government spends money on, that might be helpful. So any government employee, right, they're being paid by the government. That's a government expenditure, so that counts into GDP. Exports, so it's the value of all goods and services made in the U.S. and consumed elsewhere. Cotton, right, we talked about in our t-shirt lesson, American cotton being sent out to other places. That is an export. Made in the United States, sent somewhere else. Import, and that's the value of all goods and services produced elsewhere but consumed in the United States. Your iPhones are imports. Most clothing you wear are imports. Produced elsewhere, consumed in the U.S. We count that. We don't count that, sorry, in our GDP. That would count for the country of origin's GDP. Net export, which we do count in GDP, is exports minus imports. If you have, if this number is a positive number, then you have an export surplus, which is generally looked on as good. The United States does not have an export surplus. We have an export deficit, which means we bring in a lot more than we send out. So GDP is calculated by adding a few of these things together. We looked at consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports equal GDP. So this is an equation you should know. What goes into the forming of this very important economic indicator? The number would be useless if you didn't know what went into it. So we went over some problems with how we calculate GDP. The biggest one is going to be the underground economy that is not captured in this number. There's a lot of activity, economic activity that happens that is not reported to the government for various reasons. For instance, drug trafficking or the purchase of exotic animals. Or I think I gave the example of, a plumber friend and you pay him cash to fix your pipes. he's not going to report that to the government. It's off the books. It's still economic activity. So the GDP numbers are often really, really understated, especially in developing countries or countries that are very have cash-based economies. Oftentimes, also have an underreported GDP. I was going to watch a video. This is a video worth watching. It's the underground economy from Crash Course. Really interesting perspective on the black market. I was going to show this in class. We ran out of time, and SB Unified has decided that it is inappropriate for you, for whatever reason. So we already went over this. Underground economy is not counted in GDP for whatever reason. It doesn't have to be because it's illegal. It could just be because people don't want to report some stuff. They don't want to pay taxes. We had this discussion. Should we legalize parts of the informal economy benefited? I hope you recall that. Or if you weren't here today, we talked about the merits of legalizing some stuff that could be reported to the government and therefore be counted in our GDP. So what does per capita GDP and standard of living have to do with it? Well, that's how we divide countries up. We divide them by their standard of living. If they are have a high standard of living, they're usually called a developed country, while countries with low standard of living are called developing. So we can go over some examples of this. Countries like the United States, which has an enormous, the largest, not the largest GDP per capita, the largest GDP in the country, but per capita is still really high. The average being 15,000, the United States having 57,000. Annoying Facebook notification. Stop. Sudan, on the other hand, has a little over $2,000 in GDP per capita. This is an outdated map. This is from 2007, which is why some of it does not make sense. For instance, there's a lot of gray going on. I don't know why Syria is not gray. Probably because they're not at civil war yet. China should be a lot higher than this. It is no longer this number. I have to get the actual number. Russia, I imagine, is also larger as well. Notice that the main takeaway I want you to get from this is that many countries with low GDPs per capita, low standard of living, are African and Southeast Asian countries. South America is not doing much better, but it is better. So our top 10 economies, nominal GDP, and it's the largest economies. It should come to you as no surprise that U.S. is number one. Again, this is from 2011, so take it with a grain of salt. Things have changed. China, second, but not so close according to this. Per capita GDP, remember this is 2011. Luxembourg, because they don't have that many people, but they're a fairly rich country, they're ranked number one. Bottom, if you notice this, these countries are all African. Pretty sad, but it's the way the world is right now. You can point to a number of reasons for why this happens. We won't get into that now. You should take an international relations class in college, though. That might help. Some people have net worths that are larger than countries' GDPs, including Luxembourg here, which we saw was one of the richest countries, has the same GDP as Warren Buffett. So one man has a higher net worth than an entire country. Yeesh. This is an interesting map. Is that here is the United States with similar countries' GDPs. Notice that California has the same GDP, or at least a comparable GDP, as France, which is absurd. What's another absurd one? Poor Mississippi here only has the the GDP of Angola, a deeply impoverished African nation. So let's take a second to look at this map. It's not really going to help you for the test, which is, I know why you're watching this, but it does paint an interesting picture. Only 5 countries have a bigger GDP than California, so we're pretty lucky to live here. California is the richest state in the richest country, so yeah, pretty lucky. And Santa Barbara, I imagine, is pretty high up in the richest county of the richest state of the richest country. This is what I was going to have you do. You can still do this for extra credit if you do it before Friday. I want you to get into a group and research a country's GDP. So you can do that for extra credit or Coats Cash. All right, thanks for listening. I hope this helped. Feel free to post comments if you have any questions, and I'll answer them as soon as I can. Okay? Thanks very much.